All right, this is Anthropology in the Human Condition. Again, I've changed the title, Human Nature, because, I don't know, it sounds better, and it's in my head. Lecture number 5, Tristes Tropiques, Levi-Strauss's book Tristes Tropiques, but many other things as well. It's the 13th of October. This is group 2. And yeah, I'm going to launch right in to this, talking about Claude Levi-Strauss and his studies of the Nambikwara and Bororo, his fieldwork, if we can call it that. He certainly goes to have a look for himself, but he takes a job after his doctorate in France, takes a job in Brazil, and then spends various parts of that time, of the next few years, he's there, 4 years I think, going back and forth into the Amazon on expeditions. But there's some, he doesn't do that kind of 1 year in the tent anthropology that we've talked about already, okay? And he writes a lot about, critically, about doing anthropology and the transformation of anthropology. It belongs with him under the influence of French theory and French colonialism, well, colonial theory in a way, it should be called. But you know, he's kind of the one who changes anthropology towards theory, very much structuralism. First of all, by looking at kinship, dry topic, but the exchange of women in families, kinship, and then looking at totemism, a book that's actually translated into Tingviet, which is quite fantastic. I discovered it with my camera. Okay. Available in shops recently. Okay. This is totemism, and he basically, this book Totemism is his study of kinship system and belief system, cosmology, and exchange among the Aboriginal and Papua New Guinea, and then South American and North American groups. But the very Australian stuff and the Papua New Guinea stuff is reliant on the work of anthropologists we already talked about in this course, which is interesting. There are other things available in Tingviet now, including his recent collection of essays, Speciality, Anthropology, and Modern Condition or Situation of the Globe, something like that. I mean, he died just a few years ago. So he won't be putting out more books, although there must be an archive. And I asked you to read Derrida's essay on the violence of the letter, a section of grammatology, and Levi-Strauss's section, the reading lesson from Tristes Tropiques, but I've yet to get hold of a copy of the Tingviet version of Tristes Tropiques. Although it does exist, we'll see. You see the different versions of Tristes Tropiques cover over the years, and you'll see that there are, in fact, well, you'll see there's Tingviet version, but I haven't got hold of it yet. I've sent my agents out to track it down. It's not available at the usual sources for Hassa or somewhere. Don't have it in stock. But still, we could read the Derrida section, and he quotes large parts of the writing lesson. So there's plenty for us there. Levi-Strauss himself beside the Amazon, the river Amazon, and you know, being anthropological, not exactly like Malinowski, but you know, the sort of camp in the jungle scene. you can imagine what these expeditions could have been like for a youngish anthropologist with his wife, although we don't see her. I don't know that she was always with them, but I mean, he was certainly not traveling on his own, which is interesting. I picked out the covers of the book, as here's the edition in French, simply because of what the covers, first of all, symbolize. It's relevant to the topic. So what do we see here? Something like a human head, completely stylized. There's a drawing from Levi-Strauss's notebooks, I believe, of the kind of tattoos that the Bororo, the tribal group in the Amazon, have made upon themselves, on their faces and their chests. The chest one looks like a container and a gourd, a bottle, but also we imagine it's a heart, perhaps, decorated somewhat. And the face, well, other anthropologists like Clifford Geertz have compared it to the decorations on playing cards, you know, in a poker game, the backs of cards, that kind of geometric design. Hang on a sec, I'll get a pack of cards. I should have prepared this earlier, but this is quite handy to show, because Claude Levi-Strauss is, well, mine aren't a conventional pack of cards because I grabbed the kids' cards. They are a set, right? So let me get something that looks typical. Well, none of them do really. The fronts don't, but the backs a bit. It's not quite the thing I was after. But a pack of playing cards, a conventional one, you see them lying around the street in Ho Chi Minh City. Actually, someone could explain that to me. As I walk around over the last 4 years, as I've lived here, very often I've found playing cards, just one, thrown on the street somewhere. And I know that in like a film like Apocalypse Now, there's a scene where the terrible general who loves the smell of napalm in the morning puts the ace of clubs on the dead soldiers that his troops have killed as a symbol. But walking around the streets, I often find it does anyone know what that's, could someone tell me what that's about? Why I find playing cards on the street, and not usually one, sometimes two or three at the most, not a whole set. So why is someone dropping cards around? Is it a kind of, I can't imagine what it is. I'd be really interested to know. Anyway, so Clifford Geertz said that these drawings on the faces did resemble the backs of playing cards, and as representations of humans, I suppose, they had something like the image of the ace of clubs or the king of clubs or the queen of clubs. This Alice in Wonderland set is really quite good. That's the queen of clubs. She's a bit grumpy. The king is in color. I suppose he's the red king, the king of hearts. Where's the queen of hearts? She's the famous one, isn't she? There she is. Alice! Anyway, I wasn't planning to play cards with you. There's a Joker, the Mad Hatter, and all those characters. I do love the Mad Hatter. Right, but I don't think that's necessarily where we would go now if we were looking for somehow to say, what does this look like, this geometric pattern look like today? It reminds us, well, beside the fact that some tattooists have copied this stuff in the new trend to get tattoos that's like maybe 20 years old, that the younger people have been getting tats much more than they used to. It used to be a underclass thing. But now we might think of the kind of painting that people put on their faces to disrupt facial recognition technology from protests. Anyway, that's by the by. This is the first cover. And very quickly, when the book was translated into English, Tristes Tropiques came out in 1955. And it was a sensation in France. And so it was quite quickly, soon after, translated into English. And they made it very explicit where these images were from. And they put it on. Still a drawing, Levi-Strauss's drawing, of a Bororo person, a woman with facial tattoos. Now, the important thing wasn't necessarily the facial aspect to it. In the next, well, I'm not sure if it's the next one, I'd have to go by the prices. We see they emphasize what really was at stake is the markings. The face is gone, but the geometric pattern has been retained, although this is a bit stylized. I don't think this is the one made by Levi-Strauss. This is one that's been abstracted from his drawings and from the Bororo painting. Though another version, this was an abridged version, I think, did both, put the abstracted picture over a face. So we had the best of both worlds. In the first Tingviet version, we got a more contemporary photograph of a South American warrior, which was interesting. The more recent Tingviet version, you see, I have found it, but I haven't got hold of it. I haven't got a copy yet. But as I say, my agents are out hunting for it as we speak. In the second Tingviet version, which is the one that should be available, this one you're looking at is the older one. The image is hardly of the Bororo or the Nambikwara. It's a very stylized thing. They seem to have turned into stone, which is interesting. I mean, it's a beautiful design, etc. It matches in quality the others, but its reference to what it's about has changed. This is interesting in itself, that how we are representing these people that Levi-Strauss went to visit, to study, and how the important issues of the book appear on the cover or not, and how they appear. So that they start with the geometric design and it's on a face, but it's a very stylized face, and it's by the author, and again by the author on a face. This is a very more realist sort of sketch, to abstracting the geometric designs, because that's what Levi-Strauss's work came to be famous for. It's not just about that, which is interesting, because that's what Derrida takes up as well. And everyone finds their own interests. Not everyone, but there are so many different interests, and nearly everyone could, or I suppose everyone could have their own interpretation of what's important in the book, because it does so many things. But the cover also references what seems to be more important at the time, and the geometric shapes were important, but so were the people. And increasingly, the contemporary people are made important, although in some sense they're also what the book's about. The people that the book is about are pushed back in time somehow, or fixed in stone, something like. Although in other editions, there's so many English editions over the years that it's an American one, I think, with a photo of the Barora or the Nambikwara from the time, and another English edition where one of Levi-Strauss's photos. No, this is a French edition. Sorry, more contemporary French edition. In fact, the one I bought this in France in about 8 years ago. A photograph by Levi-Strauss. So the covers over time, let's go back to the image of all the covers. The covers over time, I haven't shown them all, right? There's versions that, there's one in the corner, do you see on the right-hand side, just shows Levi-Strauss himself. That's a more plush edition. And then there's one with a contemporary Barora man. We'll come to him a bit later. There he is, with a full-on headdress. That's very contemporary, that one. There's another. I don't think this is one of Levi-Strauss's photographs. The one of Levi-Strauss himself, right? It's in a deluxe edition. It's hardback. It's plushly laid out, and so on. But they're all telling a different version of what's inside the book. That's not particularly unusual, but we can track how they change over time. And I think that is very revealing, because increasingly over time, it's become important both to present them as they were, but in a way to fix them both in the contemporary, but in stone or in black and white, or in black and white again in the past somehow. This looks like an old photo, this one. They're not contemporaries. And there's some of the issues that Levi-Strauss brings up. Are the Neolithic people that they're described as? Well, that's just another word for primitive, which is another slur, really, a word we can't use, and absolutely should never have used. Small-scale societies, people talk about. People talk about societies without writing, right? And that's interesting. Why this symbolism is interesting. Is it a form of writing, right? What is the meaning of the significances of these patterns, or Neolithic people anyway? The question is, are they our contemporaries, or and Levi-Strauss is grappling with this issue, are they vestiges of a way of life that is no longer going to exist in the modern world? And that's why it's Tristes Tropiques, right? Sad tropics, or tragic past. Just a few years later, he brings out a book called La Pensée Sauvage, The Savage Mind. I mean, he doesn't mean to say that these people are savages, right? Although he's playing on that. Sure, at first you think that, but he's also wanting to say that these people, they have mind, they have a intellectual life that is at least as sophisticated, as complicated as the modern. And that's the big debate, right? Are these people who are a Neolithic people, or a small-scale society, or people without writing, or without history, or all the different slurs Are they to be interpreted as our contemporaries, as on the same planet as us, and to what extent are they present in the present, or are they vestiges of the past? Now, The Savage Mind, 1962, right? So 7 years after Tristes Tropiques, is trying to explore a kind of Durkheimian concept of collective, unconscious, or archetypes of what it is to be human, and what it is to have human conceptual apparatus, mind. Pensée sauvage is also something like it's a reference to a French flower as well, like a pansy, a very delicate flower, right? So it's not captured by the English translation, The Savage Mind, okay? But that's one of the meanings of la pensée sauvage. Savage pansy, savage flower, something flower, right? And in this book, as he'd already set out in Tristes Tropiques, he's interested in Freud, well, and Marx for economic and structural analysis, but interested in making a critique of Freudian, the Eurocentric nature of Freudian analysis, and kind of which is to save Freud for to say that this would also be relevant if we not only did comparative work, but looked across the world at psychological structures. Then he's famous for bringing out a couple of volumes of studies called Structural Anthropology, where he begins to look at what becomes his life work, the study of myths, mythology. So he did the work on kinship, then the work on totemism, and they were big breakthrough books, and they took big chunks of his research life for sure. But then from the 60s pretty much to the end of his life, he focuses on and becomes the expert in mythology, and especially the mythology of South America, and indigenous groups. And he has as his resource for becoming that expert and studying the myths, the ethnographic studies by hundreds of different travelers and anthropologists and explorers and missionaries and all sorts that are collected in the ethnographic collections. There's these publications of the Bureau of Ethnography, the Office of Ethnography, that record hundreds and hundreds of myths of the stories that the South Americans tell themselves about the origin of the world, the origin of pottery, of fire, right? Jaguar steals fire from the moon or something like that. The story of the lynx, the jealous potter, and he's got books on all these topics, and especially a series of 4 volumes called Mythologiques, which completely rewrote what anthropology might be. And that's quite an achievement, and we call it structuralism. He's introduced structuralism, a mode of analysis of primarily of myths, but people then adapted it to study almost anything, that took a kind of underlying architecture of the myths for, excuse me, Annabelle. Sorry. Took an underlying architecture of myths as a kind of model of the unconscious of humanity or human groups. Now, of course, there are critiques of that, because people thought that he was projecting a Eurocentric view, but he looked at the structure of these myths, and he found in the diagrammatic that we were looking at these kind of oppositions and an axis, and then oppositions where one part of the myth reflected another part of the mythic story, and that was very similar to exactly those structures that he found in the tattoos on the Bororo and Nambikuara natives. How does this work? I want to try and show this. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that in these patterns that he extracts from not just what he sees on their faces, but the structure of this he takes as a metaphor for an underlying coherence to mythology. Right? With mythology is we, the West, or modern people, right, see it as stories that are not quite true, right? Myths, right? They are stories that you tell about the ancestors that explain how things happen, but they're not like science, are they? Now, Levi-Strauss was in the business of saying, but let's look a bit more closely. They have a real logic to them, and so they are a bit scientific. And here's the axis, right? The one we're looking at, the axis, and then there's a curve on this side. The curve is opposite on the other side, but then it has a little extra bit. That's kind of the key. And I'll try and explain how and why. Right, so some of the later covers don't address this issue of structure at all, because in modern times, or in more recent decades, our interest is less in psychological structures of mind and more on the welfare of indigenous people and so on. And Tropiques is such a book that it can contain that as well. So our interpretation can be now about his defense or his arguments in favor of respecting these people and their ecological or environmental importance, their role in the forest, as the symbiotic relationship with the jungle, and if that's there. I mean, it's not a hugely strong part of what Levi-Strauss is doing in Tropiques, but he's certainly an advocate for or a critic of the way in which colonialism has decimated these people with everything from syphilis to concrete and Christianity and so on. But the covers reflect that they're no longer interested in the structures, although they're interested in the exoticism of the forest way of life, and then this photo is revealing because some of the forest has been cleared away, right? And we know that that's one of the issues of the Amazon these days, right? So how does one make a structural analysis? Let's try and do this. So Levi-Strauss is off doing his expeditions, all well and good, right? And he's also reading the collections of myths made by others and put into these the encyclopedia, basically the collection of the Ethnographic Bureau, and he's collects as many versions of these stories as he can from all sorts of groups. So he starts with the Nambikuara and the Bororo and then their neighbors, but he then collects more and more myths from area close and similar and tries to find similar versions of the same myth. and then compares them and works out, collecting different versions of the same story, works out what's different in them, and works out what is the same and how they are organized, what he calls the armature. Now, armature is something like a word. What does armature mean exactly? Let me just quickly check, because I hate to use a word wrongly, although I often do. An organ or a structure, such as teeth or thorns for offense or defense, a piece of soft iron or steel that connects the poles of a magnet or adjusting magnets, right? So a structure, a framework on which a sculpture is built, all right? So here, the armature of the myth is the framework on which the different variations of the story rest. So there are some things that are key to all of the myths. All of the stories he's collected about, say, jaguar stealing fire from the mountain or whatever, or in the first book of the mythology series, it's called From Honey to Ashes. It's all about, sorry, the second one is Honey to Ashes. The first one is about cooking, the raw and the cooked. Myths about how we got fire, humans got fire, and how they learned to cook. The raw and the cooked is the opposition in the myth that he finds. That's part of the armature. Right? So look for these oppositions between the raw and the cooked, and then different forms of this story. Usually there's a figure who provides the possibility of cooking. A magical figure like, I don't know, the jaguar, often. It's often a mythical beast, an animal in the jungle who provides men, humans, with fire or with a cooking pot or with a recipe, maybe, which allows them then to become human, so to speak, by not eating raw food like a wild animal anymore. Right? And that's really interesting and really a common theme of turns out to be dozens of myths from all over South America that he is able to find in the record, the historical record of the stories of missionaries and of explorers and anthropologists. And then you need to examine in the myths the relationships. So what is the relationship between Jaguar, the figure that brings the change, and then the characters in the story? So usually it's something like a boy and his father, they're in the forest and they're really hungry, but they don't know what to eat. They can't capture anything and so on. But then they find, I don't know, they trap an animal somehow. And what are they going to do? A trickster figure emerges magically and shows them what to do. And afterwards they set up the tribe. And that's with the origin story of the tribe, right? So people come from this crucial moment of revelation or something like that, right? So what are the forms, what are the key relationships, and what are the oppositions that you can tease out from all the stories? Raw and cooked, but in other myth cycles, because he collects them into cycles, he does all this without computers. He's using, computers, but in an old sense, he's using cards that he writes on them and puts them into an old-fashioned style computer, like a mainframe. He finds other stories. So the second volume is called From Honey to Ashes. And that's interesting because the stories there kind of show how the simple fact of cooking is one set of myths, but there's another set of myths that go, and there the opposition is raw and cooked, right? Raw, bad, dangerous animals, eat raw food. Cooked, human, society, civilization, all based on those people that have a society also have cooking. But then there's stories that kind of go too far. And one is honey, right? Which is interesting because it's a different opposition, raw and cooked, but honey and ashes. Honey is raw, but you need to go through a cultural civilization or society. You need to work to get the honey. So you can't simply find it or catch it or pick it from a tree raw. You have to risk. You have to use smoke, or you have to use protect yourself somehow to be able to get to the honey without being bitten by bees and so on. Sure, bears can go and get honey, or jaguar, I suppose, can go and get honey. They're protected by having fur, but humans are not. If you don't want to be bitten by hundreds of bees, but you still want to have honey, which of course you do because it's sweet and delicious, you need to have some kind of, well, there's a story there. And the other side of it in these myths that he finds, and it's a whole book about this, is that the other side of the extreme opposite to honey in a way is something that is too processed by culture. So honey is processed by a culture, but it's still raw. But ashes will be, or something that's burnt, overcooked, and black is no longer in culture. It's the other side of culture, dead or destroyed. Or so he's looking at these stories and finding these oppositions and looking how they move and looking for like some rule or some strategy each of the stories uses to solve a dilemma, and how different elements within the stories, the plots, change. So he finds then some myths which are about the stealing of fire so that people can cook are very similar to another myth where instead of fire, jaguar steals or brings to humans a cooking pot, or brings a stick that can be used as a weapon, a club, or then the club sometimes also turns into something you can write with. And that's fascinating. In the third volume, right, and this is over years he's writing this, the third volume is called The Origins of Table Manners. It's all about the different rules for regulating society. And the final volume is called The Naked Man, which, I mean, really, really out there stuff. So we won't be able to get into an analysis of that. But we can take from the structural study of myth in his structural anthropology volume a kind of few key steps. We need to gather versions of a story, and then we need to work out the armature of the myth, of the story, the key structure, the oppositions, and think of what the relationships are, and also then show how movement in the story resolves a problem, because this is his theory. His theory is that these myths solve problems. They are, and this is why people think that the structural analysis can be applied to other contemporary stories, like, I don't know, television soap operas and so on, or music. So they resolve a dilemma or explain some rule or emphasize some rule or something. Yeah. So we're going to try and do this with the story of Snow White. And here I've considered the story because it's one that I hoped you would maybe know. It's not a myth, it's a fairy tale, but what's the difference? It is a myth. It's one Western one, and see if this can work. We can work out what the story is. So what is the story of Snow White? Do you remember? Have you heard this one? How's your Disney? Maybe you've seen it in the film. Maybe there's several versions, which is good. And there's, of course, children's versions of the story, many different ones, and then there's an elaborated one, longer versions and shorter versions. But the key armature of the story we can work out. Okay, there's a problem, and it's that the first problem, anyway, is that there's a wicked queen and a beautiful daughter of, invariably it's like this. The mother of Snow White has died, leaving her just as a child, and her father remarries. Think of Cinderella as well. That's another version of the same, well, not the same story, but also the same scenario. Husband takes a new wife, and then suddenly the king or whoever is out of the story. His only role is that his wife dies, and his second wife is a bad choice. But anyway, she thinks that she's beautiful, the new wife. But as Snow White gets older, when she becomes 16, she's becoming very beautiful. Now, the new wife is a bit of a witch, right? She has this magical mirror and the dark arts, and she looks into the mirror and says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" Right? So here's the issue of representation, and so on. The mirror tells the wicked witch, the second wife, that Snow White is the fairest of them all, and the wife sends out a hunter to kill Snow White, to have her killed, right? Snow White is released by the hunter, right? The hunter can't kill her because he's got loyalty to the king, and instead of killing her and bringing her heart back to the queen, he substitutes her heart with that of a pig, which she shows the wicked queen. So the wicked queen thinks that Snow White is dead, and so she's now the fairest of them all. All right, the father's remarried. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Oh, her mother had jabbed her finger while sewing, and blood dropped onto the snow, and she wished for a daughter with white skin, snow, and red lips and black hair, right? And 9 months later, mother dies in childbirth. Forgot that part. Father remarries. So Snow White, the beautiful princess, is taken to the forest by the hunter, who's supposed to kill her because of the wicked queen. But he doesn't. He releases her into the forest and says, "Run, get out of this kingdom. Find somewhere else to live because it's too dangerous here. Your stepmother wants you dead." And he takes a pig's heart back to show her that she's dead. Snow White joins up with the dwarves. They work in the mines. Little people. And, in the Disney version, hi ho, hi ho, we're off to work we go. Right. Shouldn't sing, but you know that song. Anyone want to sing? They can. So they live in a forest hut. They're not there. She turns up, sees their hut, needs somewhere to hide or recover, and for some reason she cleans up, right? Why? She decides to intervene in the seven. Well, she doesn't know there's seven at the time, but I suppose she sees seven beds. She decides to clean up their house. She does the house. She's a princess, but she decides to do housework. Why is that? Anyway, so work is an interesting story, part of the story. Anyway, really the thing so far is about jealousy, and the wicked queen goes back to the mirror and says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And the mirror, poor thing, it's going to get smashed, isn't it? Says to her, "Sorry, I have to say, Snow White lives." The hunter's in trouble now, right? He's passed off a pig. He passed off a not real human heart for the human heart, but he's been exposed. Okay. Transparency issues. I don't know what, right? We got to put this into a structure. Now, the thing is that Snow White has hidden amongst the dwarves, right? Hiding from the Wicked Queen, but the Wicked Queen comes out to get her this time. She says, you can't do get a job done properly. You got to do it yourself. And she goes out to find Snow White in the forest, disguised as a seller of fruit. Now, the dwarfs have said to Snow White, they've taken her up, and they know that they're on a good thing. They've got someone to do housework for them, a perfect wife, right, for all seven. But they say to her, don't leave the house. Like, a bit imposing, but when we're at work, when we're down the mines, you're not safe. Stay inside the house. Don't leave the house. Don't go out, and don't open the door to anyone. All right, be careful. It's dangerous out there. The old lady, now the Wicked Queen, disguised as an old lady, comes round posing as someone selling apples, and she sells a beautiful apple to Snow White, who of course bites into the apple and is poisoned and falls into a coma. Right? So we're already thinking in terms of structural analysis and the message. Maybe the message is don't interrupt your work. Don't let anything interrupt your nice ordered way of work, right? Don't let anyone into don't accept a gift of an apple. I don't know. All sorts of things we could think about. But the thing is that when Snow White kind of strays from the economy of her little life with the seven dwarfs and exchanges an apple, but it takes an apple from the haggard old saleswoman, the Wicked Queen in disguise. She's been tricked. Actually, she's tricked a couple of times in the story, but it's the third time she takes the dwarves manage to save her twice. So they learn, and the third time is the poisoned apple time. She becomes unconscious. She seems dead. The dwarfs are unhappy. They put her in a glass coffin, right? Because we're looking for oppositions, that's interesting. There's the glass coffin. It's kind of like a structural balance with the mirror. The mirror can see anywhere and tells stories of truth. The glass coffin shows you the seemingly dead princess. Okay. Transparency, relationship, the glass coffin in the forest, the mirror in the castle. Right? Living or not dead, or dead in the coffin, versus living in the mirror. Even though the Wicked Queen thought she'd had the hunter kill Snow White, but the mirror tells the truth. Interestingly, the mirror, the glass coffin does not tell us the truth, because we know actually that even though Snow White seems dead and the dwarfs think she's dead, she's not. Right? But she's still, through the glass, we see even though she's dead, she's still the most beautiful of them all, the loveliest. And the story is resolved somehow when the great and powerful fair prince finds out about Snow White's story from the dwarves and decides to take her back to the castle to be properly buried because she's a queen. But on the way, the carriage that he's using to carry her in her glass coffin hits a tree root, something crossing the path, and dislodges the poison apple from her throat in Sleeping Beauty, right? When she's poisoned, it's a kiss. In Snow White, it's not so sexual. I think there are still variations, right? Anyway, she wakes up from her coma and falls in love with the prince. Poor dwarfs. I mean, they got a hard ride, didn't they? Just because they're small. The Wicked Queen's still jealous, but the Grand Prince is wise to her tricks and orders her to dance in a pair of red hot slippers until she dies. Right? There are other variations of how she dies, right? But that's interesting as well, because I don't know, think of Dorothy and the red slippers in Wizard of Oz. There are many variations. Right? So how can we put this together as a structure? You won't necessarily be able to see my... can you see that well enough? The structure, the glass coffin, the evil queen and mirror, mirror, right? The young Snow White, living innocently, working with the dwarfs in the house, or entering into a exchange relationship with a seller of apples who isn't what she seems. Okay, if the old lady who's into dirty tricks, right? She sent the hunter to take Snow White for a walk in the forest, but actually was to kill her. She uses a magic mirror. She sells poisoned apples, right? She's jealous. And what the story has to deal with, I suppose, is to get us to accept that jealousy is not the path. Right? So anyone who follows the path of jealousy will come to a sticky end. Right? Their tricks and their deceits, they are equated with jealousy. And the person who is pure, Snow White, if they stay in work, if they accept the order, right? So because she's a princess, when she accepts the order, she wakes up and she falls in love with the prince at the end, right? She's going to be okay. In between, there's a figure of the hunter whose job is to do wicked things for the queen, but he does the right thing. So he's an interesting in-between figure. And the dwarfs, who are central to the story, but somehow treated badly because they're working all the time and they have this ideal life and they look after Snow White, but they completely lose her when the prince comes along. Now, the prince's role is just right and law, right? But by setting up this structure and looking at the oppositions between truth and lie, death and the false death of the hunter killing the pig, not killing Snow White in the forest, and then Snow White dying from the apple being put into the coffin but not being dead, is another opposition that moves, right? It moves from being a ordered death, ordered by the wicked queen, right? The evil death, to being a death by accident that is then redeemed by a good deed or by the love of the dwarfs for her. They put her in a glass coffin because they love her so much. They still want to see her. And they tell the prince about her, and the prince is going to do the right thing as well and have her buried in the respectful way she should. That causes a hiccup in the story, or a hiccup in an interruption to the evil story, and the tree root intervenes somehow. This insignificant thing, a blockage in the path that the carriage is going over, bumps everything and inverts the death and the jealousy becomes is undone, and the dead Snow White comes back to life, and the forlorn prince, who's inherited a kingdom with no princess, suddenly then has the ideal wife. And yeah, of course, the working class analysis of this might be the poor old dwarves are still left working in the mines, and they don't even have a housekeeper anymore. Well, the Wicked Queen gets hers. That's good, but the exploiting system is still there. There's still a king. I don't know. So many different oppositions, and anyway, this is what a kind of structural analysis achieves. I'm not going to go into it because I don't know the story well enough, but a previous class doing this, and we could only do it in class, really. It's harder to do online, I think. Did it with the story of Dan Yong. Dan Yong, forgive my pronunciation. The story of an immortal who stands for the desire to have freedom in the time of the Hong Kings, as a woman who sees big footprints, gets pregnant, gives birth to a child. Right? Invaders come from China. The king needs heroes and comes through the village, and the child asks the mother for a steel horse, a saddle, and a whip, and he will fight the enemy. So many versions of this story, right? That's the beginning of Mulan as well, and I mean, my kids are watching these stories all the time on TV now. Anyway, he decides to fight for freedom, and the village gets him food. He grows. A whip is broken, and afterwards he returns to the sky. Right? He fights. He's fought for free. Anyway, that same structural analysis should be possible, and if someone can then go through this and tell me, as we did in the class, it'd be great, how the oppositions here between freedom and invasion, footprints and a broken whip maybe, or freedom, the steel, a horse, saddle and whip. I think it's a steel, a horse. There should be a comma in that. And the fight, the food for the village, and the broken weapon, returning to the sky. These could be explored in that structural way. I'm not so sure, but as I remember it, there were some great suggestions that came out of that session. Now, in a big book on Levi-Strauss, Maurice Godelier talks about this myth systems, right? The mythological world entirely focused on imaginary time, remote past, where gods, humans, animals, and plants all live together. And after this time, then the world became what it is today. So these stories about animals and plants and that symbiosis between them all, there had to be a time when the animals ceased being people. Like Jaguar had been in the myths a human actor, and then became an animal. This works for different myth systems as well, Aboriginal dream time and so on, to tell stories about origins. Mythical time, dream time, is when the sun emerges, the moon, stars, heavenly bodies, animals, plants, cooking, hunting, poison, tobacco. Tobacco is a really interesting one because it's a natural thing, but it's got to be burnt to ash to become valuable to humans. Why are there salmon in rivers? why do we have sex? Where does water come from? All these stories are kind of found by Levi-Strauss as they're in the myths, but the myths tell they structure them for contemporary life, for the people who are telling these stories. So it's really quite genius, but in these 4 volumes of the mythologies, 2,000 pages, 813 myths, and some myths from other parts of the world, 350 tribes, Levi-Strauss can be criticized for having projected French theoretical models onto the myths of the people. I mean, Levi-Strauss says, that the myths are speaking through him. Right? Now, his 4 volumes list all the different knowledge that the myths include. Right? So, ecological insights, astronomical and meteorological information, they're present in the myths. So the myths are kind of science. And they have maps of the world. Right? They describe where the environment that these people live in. And so with his diagrams that he takes down and his lists of, and it's almost like very similar to, and this is where the criticism comes in as well, very similar to taxonomies and the zoological plans that anthropologists, zoologists, and scientists in the 19th century were anyway, and the early 20th century were anyway making. So the criticism is, are these systems, structures, really in the myths or in Levi-Strauss's interpretation of the myths? And that becomes the key thing, right? Though Godelier says, whatever the case, it's exceptional, it's amazing, right? And the issue is what do the Indians hear when they listen to their myths? Not just the story being told, which explains why, I don't know, women have periods or the moon has spots or whatever, but they hear through images and ideas the symbolism, the content of their understanding of the world. Right? So myths that seem to have just no real rhyme or reason. Why is the jealous wicked queen Snow White working with the dwarves, and why does she do the housework? Suddenly they seem nonsensical. They actually explain ways of living. Don't know if you can hear that. My neighbors are drilling. All right, so maybe we better. No, they seem to have stopped. The question is, they're not stopping. The question is whether the myths live in, or the science lives in the myths, or it's Levi-Strauss finding in this abundant level of stories, like interpreting its existence in there. And you know, he's been looking through these volumes. You see the volumes at the top there of the record of all the myths, right? He was able to argue that myths are constitutive of the logic, answering questions that the people need to have answered, like why is it that we cook things this way? Why do we do the things we do? Why do we have table manners? Why do we have, you know, why eat in this way? Why have kinship or incest taboo? And all these things are kind of explained in very many different ways. And in effect, what he's saying is that there's no reason to think that these mythological ways of explaining those things are any better necessarily than our ways. We obey the law, which is like a alien power. Now, Levi Strauss, you know, bless him, he lived to 101 years old. He was given many awards by the French government, and his intellectual effort is astonishing. He is so focused on this for like so many decades. Godelier says it's superb, wonderful, provocative, and it makes no sense. Now, are they a language? Yes, but the myths themselves don't think through the problems. It's people telling the stories do. So the myths can't really operate in men. This is what Godelier says. And Levi-Strauss says the myths are doing this, solving the problem. The myth of Snow White is solving the problem, but it's not. It's the telling of the story that is used then by us to solve the problem. Here's Levi-Strauss in the photo getting to meet Sarkozy, the then French Prime Minister. I'm going to stop for a bit, as I know I've gone on for too long. I'm putting this up. You can also go back to the lecture tape and read it. I won't read through Godelier's thing, but Godelier's book was really important. He is a student of Levi-Strauss, and his critique is really valuable. Reading this mythology series is very an impressive body of work, but in the end, what's important about Tropiques is not just that. It's that these people have been subject to the invasion of anthropologists and missionaries and traders and capitalism, and their way of life was destroyed. And Levi-Strauss tells that story in Tropiques as well. So while there's the basis of his life story, actually Tropiques is a powerful book because it also tells something that we want to make into a new problem-solving mythology for our time. Respect for the people who have feathers in their hair and through their noses, and who were custodians of the forest from a time before the scourge of capitalism destroyed the environment and made living on this planet potentially, well, evidently unsustainable. And now we tell ourselves myths of going off planet and living on Mars, or China colonizing Mars, or America colonizing the moon. I'd rather live in the forest, but let's see, or not, who knows. All right, so let's get into the discussion of the reading and your comments. I'll give time for discussion.